All right, so welcome back. We're going to be going over interacting with the DOM today. So this is going to be one of the fundamental concepts of JavaScript and why you would actually use JavaScript in terms of giving the users the data that they actually want and the interactions that they actually want. So interacting with the DOM directly with JavaScript. Now, to be clear, there is a fundamentally different group out there that goes, no, you shouldn't do that at all. You should leave that to libraries. Things like jQuery used to do, or something more current like React, where React interacts the DOM for you. It renders the DOM for you. And their claim is that they can do it more efficiently. And they do it through what is called a virtual DOM. So they only change nodes that have changed. I mean, at some point later on in the more advanced web courses, we'll go over performance of these things. But generally speaking, just be aware that there are two fundamentally different camps in this. We here at Alfred State, again, are trying to show you where these lines are drawn and how some of these libraries actually work behind the curtain, okay? We much rather give you the tools necessary and the awareness that is needed for you to build your own tools. Okay, that is the goal here. So with that said, we are going to jump into manipulating the DOM. So first we got to go over what the DOM is, because it's been a hot second since you guys have actually thought about it in any meaningful way. DOM stands for Document Object Model. Okay, JavaScript can obviously manipulate the DOM through logic, through code. And then DOM manipulation requires a re-render. So when you are altering something on the DOM, typically speaking, you want to do it once. Okay. If you end up running a loop that appends something to the DOM, yeah, it's going to work, but it's going to be very, very inefficient. And especially when you get your slower devices, it's really going to hurt that user experience. So we're definitely going to show you how to do this in a way that is efficient. And we can move on from there. And just be aware that there is a wrong way to do this, and there's going to be no error thrown. All right, getting content values. Okay, so here are the typical ways. You have your query selectors. So this is a ES6 type of methodology here. This mimics what jQuery used to do. It is helpful at times to actually get something if you want to select something by a couple of tags and then the ID. That is helpful. If you're trying to just get something by an ID or a class name, the ES5 version of this is a little bit more readable from my perspective. So the document.getElementById does exactly what it says it does. Query selector doesn't necessarily do that, but it does get you out of jams when you're working with Magento from my past. I use this quite a bit to get around some of the nonsense that they had. Okay, so this is one of the things where you just know your tools, okay? You have two options here. I'm going to be using getElementById and getElementByClassName just because it's a little bit more readable. You can use query selectors. All right, query selector is going to give you back the first matching element. So the first thing that it actually matches is going to stop and then give you back that element, okay? So if I did a query selector by a class name, it's going to give me that first instance of that class. Okay, and we'll get into in a second why that's important and why that is a little confusing if you go down this path. All right. So this is part of the reason why we don't use multiple IDs either. So when we get to getElementById, I'll go into it a little bit more. I do want to point out here that the Mozilla documentation on this instead of W3C is significantly better. And generally with JavaScript stuff as a whole, the Mozilla MDN documentation tends to be better for JavaScript. Okay, query selector all, same thing, except for it's going to return all matching elements. don't know what else to say here, so I'm going to move on. Get element by ID. All right, so find an element by an ID. It does exactly what it says it does. However, the rant that we need to go on here is that if you have multiple IDs, it's only going to bring up the first one. And this is where students get in trouble because they go, okay, well, I'm going to get this by ID. I have a bunch of IDs. Why doesn't it get all the IDs? Why doesn't that work? It's because the code, the API that you're calling through JavaScript is just simply not set up for that. And it's bad practice to have multiple IDs. Okay, so that leads us nicely into the second one. If you need to have something multiple times for the similar name, it needs to be with a class. All right, so get elements by class name, find all the DOM elements within a class name, returns an array, and that's something I didn't really focus on with querySelector all. querySelector all is going to bring you back an array. Get elements by class name is going to bring you back an array. querySelector and then get element by ID are both going to bring you back a single object. All right, so both of those are important because that becomes just a different object type, and then you have to account for that. All right. So here's a little example of getting information off of the DOM. All right, so this is from an old project of mine. And get elements by class name, we have service IDs, and then if I bring you, so this is going to bring us back an array. And then if we come down here, I need to bring your eyes up here. We have a loop service.link, so we're going to have multiple service IDs, but it's going to be based on how many services this particular person has. So this was a hairdresser styling scheduler app thing. And they had the ability to represent themselves online, and then we can dynamically make appointments based on what times were available. But each service had a different length or different time slots that it would take up. So the example that was given to me is that if I'm going to do a hair coloring, the color itself is going to be a half hour, the drying is going to be a half hour, and then the after coloring procedures are another half hour. So that's an hour and a half, or 3 time slots, because I had them at a half hour, 3 time slots for that one service. So this particular application went through and said, hey, I'm looking for this service. Do you actually have enough time for it? And then if you do have enough time, which day? Okay, so the service ID down here, there's going to be a bunch of these, because if you're going to have 10 services, you're going to have 10 service IDs. So give me back all the service IDs in an array. All right. So that's how you get information off the DOM. That's going to give you back an object. Okay. And then we can work with that object from there. And we'll get into an example of what that means here in a little bit, in a few minutes. But for the time being, just understand that it's an object. Okay. Which leads us nicely into this. So getting information from the object itself, you can get attributes. Now, and to back up a little bit, for the people that are online watching this on YouTube and have never seen anything else, dot syntax is a C-oriented class property. So the object that you get back acts like a class. So if I do dot attributes, that's off of a JavaScript object. So dot child element, okay, child nodes, children, class list, class names, client with, inner text, inner HTML, all those are pretty common. You'll end up using those quite a bit. Maybe not in this class or your project, but you will use it eventually, and more than likely by the time you leave Alfred State. Okay, so all of those are pretty common. W3 Schools has a nice little list of the elements that you can actually address. And then I'll show you how to do that through the browser as well to see what elements and properties are on that object. Okay. So using that same example again, after we get our service IDs, now we have an array. So we're going to loop through this array. If services class list contains selected, so if it's selected, okay, we want that service ID, and then we want the inner text of that service ID. Okay, so we're going to get back a string of a number, and then we can convert that string of a number to a number if we need to. Okay, appending to the DOM. All right, so if you want a dynamic website and it's not static, you're going to be doing this. You have to append to the DOM because you're going to get information back, typically off of a user profile, and then you're going to have to append that user profile to the DOM itself when you actually get it back from the server. I guess you could do a page request, but kind of sort of going out of style, but it'll come back eventually, I promise. So this, like I said here in a couple of seconds ago, this allows you to pen information or append information to the DOM dynamically. So depending on the user, depending on the state, depending on what they're trying to do, we can display the information that we want as long as we have the logic there to support it. Okay, so, and this is the general procedure for this. You're going to create an element. Okay, got a handful of options here: button, div, action tag, anchor, depending on who you're talking to. All right. And then you can set the data of that element. And then you can append it to the DOM with append child. Okay. Now, to be clear, if you have multiple things that you're trying to append to the DOM, you have to do that all at once. So if you have a loop somewhere where you need to alter an object, you're going to want to put that object in memory first. And then again, I'll show you guys how to do this, but you're going to want to put that object in memory first. Then once everything is set, append everything to the DOM all at once if you have multiple things, right? Because that's going to be one render and not the example that I had a few slides ago was that those time slot, that scheduling app, there was a couple hundred time slots in there. You don't want to re-render the DOM a couple hundred times. You need to do that all at once. Okay, general procedure. Determine the element you need, obviously. Okay, so some of the HTML tags have different attributes that you can append to them. Depending on which attribute you need, you might have to use that tag. Okay, put the content in the created element. Okay, so if you have a paragraph, you need to put some text in that paragraph. Makes sense. Set the attributes needed. If you need to give it an ID or a class, you go ahead and do that. And then you append the new element to the parent. So again, like I was saying before, if you have multiple of these, you're going to want to append it to memory first, and then append that object that you have in memory to the DOM. Okay, that's going to be significantly more efficient. So that's going to bring us to the end of the lecture portion of this. We're going to have a demonstration here in a couple of minutes, and I will see you then. Later. All right, welcome back, and this is the demonstration portion of the JavaScript manipulating the DOM. We're going to do a hyper simplistic example for this one, and we're going to start over on the project that we've been working on up to this point. It's good to practice some of these hyper basic things on occasion. So first thing that we're going to need to do is have you guys get the same template that I have here. So doc type HTML, we're telling the browser that we need HTML5, the root tag of HTML, the head tag with the metadata in it, and then an empty body tag. Speaking is difficult, apparently. All right. So once you have that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a div here because we might need some control over that. Let's give it an ID of input container. Some pretty obvious foreshadowing here. And then we're going to add an input. Okay. We're going to give it a type of text. Like so. And then we will give our little input a button of submit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to come over to the browser, and just like before, I have this on live server, so it will update automatically for me. All right. So the next thing that I want to do, nah, I lied. I don't want to do that. I am actually going to go down here, and I'm going to use a new tag that we haven't used yet called footer. Okay. And then inside of footer, this is another tag that we haven't used yet, which is script. Now, script, we're going to have to tell this attribute where to find our JavaScript. Now, here's the JavaScript folder, so /JavaScript. And then I'm going to call this index.js. Now, the problem is that we have not made this. Have not made this yet. So let's come over here, make sure that folder is active. So this little blue bar, we're going to hit a new file here, index.js. All right. So we're doing pretty good here. Traditionally speaking, I believe it was text JavaScript. Traditionally speaking, you used to need this to tell the browser what type of script this was. You don't have to have it anymore. For the sake of demonstration and to make sure that you guys are at least aware that these things exist when you run across them, because it wasn't that long ago that this was not true. We actually needed this type here. And just for to make sure that I am right, script tag text, very likely I am correct. Okay, script element, blah, 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 blah. Defer, we'll get into that in a second. Well, not this second. We'll talk about it eventually. Okay, so it's saying here that you, with mean type of browsers are lenient and only block them if the script is served with an image. Okay, video or audio. Okay, so what this is saying here, as long as you don't have image, video, or audio type, the script isn't going to be blocked. So there's the details on why you don't need it anymore, but it's just you don't need it anymore. And then there's the proof that this is right. So there's that. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to open this up and make sure that this is actually coming through. So one of the things that students get caught up on quite a bit when things don't work the way they expect it to is a good chunk of the time is they don't even get the file. Okay, so if I refresh here, right here is our index.js, and I went to the networking tab, and this will tell you what you are and are not getting. And this over here is the server response. So we're getting a 200 here for index.js. So we are doing good. Now I see some red down here. We got a get error 404 not found for favcon. Yeah, who cares? No one cares. Okay, so I'm going to close that for now. We will need it eventually. Okay. Now, are we good here? I think we're good here. We're not good here. ID of input, so we can actually address it. And then ID of button, so we can address the button. Okay. So now that we're moving on to the index.js, there's a couple things that we need to do. First and foremost, we need to make sure that the DOM is actually loaded when we click this button. So there is a possibility, something this small, very, very, very unlikely, that the user would be able to click a button before our JavaScript is parsed and loaded and actually can handle it. So a way around that is window.onload equals a function. Okay, so what this is on the window element. So there's a good chunk of elements in JavaScript where there are default pre-made elements and objects made by the browser. Okay, window is one of them, and window has a property of onload. Onload happens to be a event listener. Okay, we'll get into what that is here in just a second, but you're just going to have to believe me for a moment because we got to get to event listener. So if I hover over onload here, property onload this global event handler. So hey, the browser made this. Okay, EV for event. Okay, oh, too far. This window EV event, and he fires immediately after the browser loads the object. Okay, so that's what I was looking for. The visual code does a pretty good job of telling you what these things do if you don't know what they are. Okay, so fires immediately after the browser loads the object. All right, so after Windows loaded, we're going to run this. And what we're going to do is that we're going to set event listeners. Okay. Like so. And I am realizing that I probably should have went over event listeners before this. They go hand in hand though, so kind of can't get around it. So set event listeners, we made a function here. Okay, we're going to open up that function, and then we are going to go look for the button, and then we're going to go look for the input. All right, we need both. However, we don't need it for the listener. So we're going to call this button. Okay, and then we are going to get, well, first we need the document object. The document object is another global variable made by the browser that has all the DOM elements inside of it. So document getElementById, and we had that ID set to button. Okay, so this is going to give us our button back. Now that we have that object, add event listener. And this is where you're just going to have to believe me for a second, because we haven't went over listeners. We want the click listener. And then on top of that, we want, how do I want to handle this? Let's go ahead and show input like this. So this second object over here, or the second, yeah, well, it's technically an object, but this second parameter needs to be a function. Right now it's blue because we haven't made that function. So let's go ahead and do that. Function, show input. And I am going to show you something that makes traditional programmers very upset. And I'm going to pass in this event object variable. Okay, the event object or variable is made by the browser, and by the time it actually gets to this function, it's already been reset with whatever event triggered this event listener up here. Okay, so now that we have that, and again, this is very, just believe me at this point, because we have to get some of the foundations down before you truly understand all of it. But okay, so at this point, what we need is the event that was triggered. Okay. No, that would be a button. I have myself a logic error. Okay, let's back up for a second. Okay, so there's that button. All right. So the other thing that I am going to do, I'm going to do input up here, document get element by ID. This was input. When this event listener is triggered, again, we haven't covered this yet, so just believe me for a second. We are going to show input. And then we are going to get that information out of that input. And for this, it just so happens to be value. Okay, so we're going to pass in that input value there. And then I'm going to rename it to input value. Okay, and then I'm going to do we're going to append that information to the DOM. So one of the things I have noticed already is that we have no place to append that new answer. Okay, so let's go ahead and change that. Div ID answer container. And I'm going to leave it like that. I'm going to save, make sure it's still there. And now what we're going to do is get answer container, document, get element by ID. And this is going to give us the ability to address that answer container. Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is answer container dot inner text answer container dot, oh, wrong thing, input value. Okay, so let's see what we get. Now, come over here. We got this and this answer container. I'm pretty sure this is going to work. Let's go ahead and save that. Save this. Come back over here. I am going to test text. I'm going to hit the submit button, and then we get back test text. Okay, I'm going to do something else. And now we have something else. Okay, so very, very simple. And we're going to walk through the process on this now, and hopefully it makes sense to you guys. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set a debugger here. And what this is going to do is stop execution. Because we have a single threaded language, we can actually stop the entire execution of the JavaScript by putting a debugger here. So this is really, really helpful for obviously debugging, but it gives you a state and then it stops, right? So whatever state that the JavaScript is in, when you hit this debugger, you get to see what the state is in. And then you can obviously, depending on where you have that debugger, you're going to get a different state. Okay, so debugger, and then debugger down here as well. So we're going to walk through this entire process of how this is working. So with that, I'm going to refresh. There we go. Now I'm going to open this up. Okay, notice that we're up here, window.onload, debugger. We have not set our event listeners yet. This is about to run. Okay, we are going to come down here to the play button, bang. Set event listeners, we're going to run this function, and now we are down here. So now we have button. Notice what we got back. We have all of these properties. We got an entire object back, happens to be that button. But here are all the attributes that you can address from that button. And with JavaScript, or at least with Firefox, it tells you what the current values are when you're in debugging mode. So if I come over here, so the base URI, if you ever needed it, was this. Loopback 5500 start index.html. All right, so one of the things that is really useful here is instead of this URI, you can use client height, which happens to be 18 pixels. Client width happens to be 49 pixels. Those are common. I am looking for text. Is connected, connectable edit, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's come back down. I am looking for inner text, and I might not have that property because it is a button tag, and I typically don't use button tags. We use divs, but okay, right there, if you really need to know what it was, type of submit. I did not put this on there. That is a default value. I'm looking for inner text though. Next sibling text. It's nope. There it is. Inner text submit. So if you needed that information out of the button for what it was actually called for some reason, and this is more common for like text fields, paragraphs and divs and spans, that type of thing, then you can get it from here, inner text. And then inner HTML has something very similar. We will go over the difference. It is very important, just later. For the time being, use inner text, and then we will use inner HTML when it's appropriate. Okay, so back to the procedure. We have our event listener that's about to be created. All right. And then once I hit this play button, you're going to notice that we're not going to hit any more debuggers anymore. Okay, there's that. The reason why this is because once this event listener triggers, right, this task hasn't even been created yet. This hasn't been put into the event loop. This is the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. So we're waiting for user input. It just so happens to be for them to click the submit button. So when we hit the submit button, we're going to start running this listener now. So we're inside of this function right here, show input, input.value. So if I hover over value, we get something else, and it's a string. That's something else that we should probably talk about and review, that everything on the DOM, everything that you get off of the DOM is a string. So if you remember from the earlier lectures in the series, the DOM is known as a jagged string array because it holds a bunch of strings. So anything that you get off of the DOM is going to be a string. Okay? For better or for worse. Now, since we have text here, that works out fine. If you're pulling off numbers from the DOM, they're still going to be strings. They're just strings of numbers. So they do have to be converted. All right. So, and then we're going to come down to show input. So this is about to run. I'm going to hit this play button again. Show input, input value. We're still getting something else, right, for a string. And then answer container, we're getting something back for answer container. That's good. We're getting something else as a string, and then we're going to apply it to inner text. Notice that answer container doesn't have anything in it. It's an empty string. And when we hit play here, this is finally going to show up over here, right there. Okay, so that's going to do it for the hyper simplistic example of getting information off the DOM, which was this bit right here that came out of the input, and then reappending it to the DOM, which was this bit right here. Okay, so that is the overly simplistic basic example of just manipulating the DOM. The next thing that we're going to go over is event listeners in more detail. And both of these are very dependent on each other. So it didn't really matter if I did event listeners first. If that was the case, then you'd have no reason to use event listener. And then if I did this first, which I did, then you'd be confused about event listener. So you need both of these. The other part is coming up very, very shortly. And you'll be well on your way if you understand this concept and the one that's coming up. And then you can start practicing and getting a little bit better at this. All right. So with that said, I will see you in the next one, which is event listeners. Later.